Dinner hadn't even fully started when the house changed. The candles on the table flickered the way they do when a door opens somewhere far down a hallway. Even though every door in the house was shut, Daniel was reaching for the bread. Mara was smiling, that small, polite smile people wear when they're still learning a family's rhythm. And I was smoothing the corner of a napkin between my fingers, trying to keep the night steady, but the steadiness didn't last. Not once she spoke my name, a name I had buried decades ago. We had spent the afternoon preparing, though preparing was too strong a word. Daniel insisted on helping, which really meant he hovered near the stove and stole pieces of roasted carrot whenever he thought I wasn't looking. I let him. Mothers pick their battles, and I had already lost him enough times in small ways. Mara arrived just before dusk. The light outside turned the living room windows into mirrors, gold first, then a soft blue. She stepped into that fading color with a calmness that surprised me. Her hands were folded in front of her, her shoulders straight, as though she had practiced walking into this house. I tried to ignore the tightness in her smile. I reminded myself that Daniel loved her. That should have been enough. We sat at the table, the three of us, with the quiet comfort of plates settling and forks touching their edges. The dining room always hums at night. The old walls breathe, the floorboards adjust. It's a house that has lived long enough to remember every footstep. I watched her when she thought my eyes were elsewhere. She looked around as though the house was familiar to her. Not in a sentimental way, more like someone scanning for old ghosts. But I brushed off the thought. New people often look like that the first time they sit in a home built on memory. For a moment, it felt almost warm. Then the warmth thinned, stretched, and snapped. It happened between the salad and the roast, so quietly that I almost thought I imagined it. Mara set down her fork. The small clink echoed too sharply. She turned to me, not to Daniel, not to the food, but directly to me, her gaze steady, and she said, softly, politely, as if it belonged to me, Lena, could you pass the salt? The name dropped into the room like a stone into still water. My breath didn't catch, not exactly, but something inside me paused, as though an old wound heard its own echo. Daniel laughed, a quick nervous thing that didn't belong to him. Babe, her name's, he said my real name, the one I raised him under. She blinked once. Just once. But she didn't correct herself. I'm so sorry, she murmured, though there was no apology in her eyes. Slip of the tongue. A slip. No one slips into a name they've never heard. The salt shaker felt cold when I finally passed it to her. Our fingers didn't touch, but I swear the space between them chilled. I tried to focus on the food. The steam rising from the roast. The soft scrape of Daniel's knife. But my thoughts curled tight like fists. Lena. I hadn't heard that name in years, decades, maybe. And even then, only whispered. Only once. Only when I was trying to be someone else in a town I promised never to revisit. That chapter of my life was sealed, yet. Mara had spoken it like she'd known it all along. Daniel didn't notice the silence that followed. He kept talking about a trip they were planning, a small cabin near the mountains, somewhere quiet. He was rambling, the way he always did when he was trying to fill a growing crack in the air, but Mara wasn't listening to him. She was watching me, not boldly, no. That would have been easier to name. Her glances came sideways, in faint flickers, the way someone watches the past walk into the room. Her smile stayed gentle. Her hands stayed still, and yet, something in her eyes shifted. Recognition? Regret? A reminder? I found myself studying her face in pieces. The way her lashes cast thin shadows on her cheek. The tiny freckle near her left jaw. The faint tremor in her throat when she swallowed. There was nothing familiar about her, nothing that should have pulled a forgotten name from my bones. So how? A memory surfaced without warning, a bus station at dusk. A woman calling me Lena, in a voice thick with fear. A secret folded into an envelope. A promise never kept, but the memory was too old, too buried, too faded to reach for still. Why did Mara look at me as though she knew that story? I lifted my gaze. She didn't look away this time. The room seemed to shrink, not physically, but emotionally. The way a truth draws walls closer. When Daniel stepped into the kitchen to check the dessert, the thin thread of calm snapped. Mara and I were alone in the hush of the dining room. She didn't speak. But she didn't need to. Her eyes held something I recognized far too well. Knowledge she shouldn't have, and an intention she wasn't ready to reveal. When the night finally settled and dishes stopped moving and Daniel laughed from the kitchen, trying to keep the evening normal, I felt that coldness again. It sat beneath my ribs, quiet and certain. Like a truth crawling toward the surface. Mara lifted her glass. Our eyes met for a heartbeat too long. And she smiled, not kindly, not cruelly, but knowingly. That was when I understood. This wasn't a slip. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a harmless mistake. She said the name on purpose. A name I had never spoken in this house. A name Daniel had never heard. A name tied to a life I had buried so carefully that even I rarely touched its memory. I watched the candlelight waver across the table. Bending in a draft I couldn't feel, somewhere in that soft flicker. A realization settled. She didn't just know my name. She knew why I hid it, and whatever story brought her to my son. It wasn't finished with me yet. The morning light was soft, pale, stretched thin across the kitchen tiles. Steam curled from the kettle in slow spirals, filling the room with the faint smell of metal and boiled water. The floorboards groaned under their own weight, or maybe under mine. I could never tell. Mara sat across from me at the small table, a delicate cup of tea in her hands. Her posture was perfect, too perfect, like a painting that had been propped up for display. She didn't move unless she meant to. She didn't blink unless necessary. And the quiet of the room was heavy, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I moved slowly, arranging the spoons and sugar packets, pretending the motion kept my mind anchored. The previous night still lingered, her voice, soft and knowing, calling me a name I had never spoken aloud in this house. Daniel was oblivious, of course, still dreaming of their upcoming trip, their plans, the future he thought was simple and bright. I tried to remember that warmth, the way life can feel normal when everything seems ordinary. But Mara's presence pulled the air taut, like a violin string stretched too far. She raised the cup to her lips, slow, deliberate. The steam drifted across her face, catching in the soft lines of her mouth. She said she was sorry for the mix-up at dinner, and her voice was measured, calm, almost too even. Not an apology. Not the kind that unravels a tension. More like a statement, polished and distant. And yet, there was a weight behind it. A curiosity. A watchfulness that I could feel in my bones. Daniel hummed as he buttered toast, completely unaware of the thin wire of unease pulling through the room. He laughed, cheerful and loud in contrast to the silent tension coiling between Mara and me. I could feel her gaze, soft and steady, on every movement I made, like she was taking mental notes of things I didn't realize were worth remembering. Every photo on the wall, every trinket on the shelf, she studied them as if each held a secret meant for her eyes alone. Her eyes lingered on the photos not framed, not hanging, tucked away in drawers or stacked in corners. Family pictures, old and yellowing, faces I had loved and feared, smiles I had thought I could forget. She leaned slightly forward, just enough to catch the light on a glass frame, the reflection of someone who used to be me. Daniel chattered about his work, about the cabin trip, about plans for the weekend, his voice a bright thread trying to weave normality into the room, but Mara wasn't listening to him. Not really. She tilted her head, subtle, careful, examining the corner of a photo of my mother holding a baby, a different baby than Daniel. Her fingers traced the rim of her cup. Her nails caught the morning sun. I wanted to ask what she was thinking. I wanted to tell her she had no right to look so deeply at my past. I sipped my own tea to keep my voice from shaking. The porcelain felt warm, grounding, a small tether to the floor beneath me. I watched her, wondering what she saw in the shadows, in the silences between my sentences. Was she trying to piece me together? Or was she searching for something else entirely, something I had forgotten existed? She didn't smile. She didn't frown. Her expression was calm, unreadable, like a lake before dawn. And in that silence, I realized, I didn't know her. Not really. Not yet. But somehow, she already knew pieces of me I had long since hidden. When Daniel finally left the table to grab plates from the counter, the air shifted. Mara's gaze followed him, then returned to me, sharper now, intentional. The room felt smaller. The steam from her cup curled around my head, almost like a warning. I could feel her studying me, weighing me, measuring the cracks in my composure. She leaned back slightly, settling into her chair with a slow exhale. Her eyes drifted to the shelves above the stove, the knickknacks I had collected over decades. The way she looked at my home was different, like someone examining a map they intended to follow. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't politeness. It was searching. Searching for a story that I thought had ended years ago. I wanted to ask her outright, why are you here? Why are you looking for pieces of me I buried? But the words didn't come. Instead, I just watched, silent, noticing every tilt of her head, every blink, every pause in her breath. There was something in her hands, in the stillness, in the way she held herself that said she knew more than she let on, and a quiet question whispered in my chest, was she here to find Daniel's future? Or to dig up my past? The kitchen was quiet again. Outside, the light grew warmer, but inside, the shadows clung to the corners. I sipped my tea, letting the warmth anchor me to the table, to the moment, to the room. Mara finally looked up from the photo she had been studying, her gaze meeting mine for just a heartbeat. Her expression didn't change. Polite. Neutral. Curious. And then she smiled, faint, almost imperceptible. I understood, in that instant, that she wasn't done. She wasn't here for a casual morning tea. She was here for the story hidden behind my eyes. The one I hadn't shared with anyone, and as I watched her hands curl around the cup, the quiet hum of the house pressing against my shoulders, I realized, this day had only just begun. And whatever questions she carried with her, they would not leave without answers. The house was quiet, but not empty. The creak of the floorboards beneath my feet felt louder than it should. Sunlight sliced through the half-drawn curtains, dust motes hovering like tiny ghosts in its path. I closed the bedroom door softly, careful not to disturb the echoes of normal life outside. The old trunk waited at the foot of the bed, its corners chipped, its lock worn smooth from years of handling. It smelled faintly of cedar and mothballs, the scent of memory kept too long. I knelt in front of it, tracing the faded scratches along its surface, and for a moment, I felt 17 again, the girl I had tried to forget. Folding herself into secrets no one else could carry, the afternoon had unfolded in quiet chaos. Daniel and Mara had left to run errands, the sound of the front door clicking shut lingering longer than I expected. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the distant hum of traffic outside, trying to slow my heartbeat. Mara's name, Lena, lingered like smoke, curling in the corners of my mind. I hadn't used it in years, not in my own home, not in any life that had moved forward. The trunk had always been a container for things too fragile for the present. A diary, yellowed and soft, with the words of a girl who didn't yet know how to survive. A torn letter, ink faded, the edges brittle under my fingers. A photograph I had tried to burn once, the edges charred, the image smudged, but still holding the weight of a memory I had hoped to erase. I ran my hand over the photograph. A name stared back at me from the page, Lena. I could feel the past pressing through, the choices I had made at 17, the losses I had carried in silence. Why did it feel like Mara already knew these things? Had she stumbled across them online, or had she been guided to find them in ways I couldn't yet see? The trunk opened with a reluctant groan, hinges creaking like an old spine. I lifted the diary, the pages smelling faintly of smoke and forgotten afternoons. The ink had faded, but the words were still mine, still raw, confessions I had whispered only to paper, truths I hadn't dared tell anyone. I flipped through slowly, letting the letters seep into my fingertips, letting the girl I used to be speak through the quiet of the room. Beneath the diary lay the torn letter. I unfolded it carefully. The edges cracked, as if protesting against the exposure. I traced the words with a finger, remembering the day I had written them, the fear I had felt, the impossible decisions I had been forced to make. A photograph rested beneath the letter. I lifted it gently, feeling the scorch marks along the edges. The girl in the photograph stared back at me with wide, uncertain eyes, a version of myself I had promised never to see again. I thought of Mara, sitting across from Daniel that morning. Her voice steady, her posture deliberate. The way she had used the name Lena, as if it were her own right to speak it. It wasn't possible that she should know these fragments of my past. Yet here they were, rising from the trunk, tangible and aching, like smoke curling in a closed room. I traced the photograph's edge, feeling the small burn marks under my fingertips. Memories came back in fragments, the way the sun had fallen across a riverbank that summer, the weight of choices too heavy for a 17-year-old to bear, the one person I had trusted and lost. All of it wrapped up in a single name, a single word Mara had spoken that morning with eerie certainty. A thought crept into my mind, a whisper I tried to ignore. Had she found this intentionally? Was this coincidence impossible? I closed my eyes and imagined her walking through my house, seeing what I had hidden for decades, piecing together a story she had no right to know. The room felt smaller. The air heavier. I placed the photograph back into the trunk, aligning it with the torn letter and diary, as though arranging them could keep the past in its place. But the feeling lingered, the sense that some invisible thread connected Mara to my history, drawing her toward pieces of me I had kept locked away. I ran my fingers over the diary one last time. It felt like touching a shadow. Familiar, yet untouchable. I closed the trunk gently, the lid settling with a sigh, the faint smell of cedar curling upward. The sunlight had shifted, casting long lines across the carpet, painting the room in golden shadow. I stood in the middle of the floor, letting the quiet stretch around me, listening to the house remember every footstep, every creak, every whisper of the past. For a long moment, I simply breathed. And then I realized, whatever Mara had discovered, whatever knowledge she carried with her, it had found its way into the present without knocking. The name Lena, the girl I used to be, the secrets I had hidden, they were no longer only mine, and somewhere deep in the stillness, I felt the first flicker of something new, curiosity, fear, and the faintest edge of dread. Had she stumbled into the past? Or had she been guided here for a reason I wasn't ready to see? The trunk sat closed, silent. And I knew, as I turned toward the window, that this afternoon was only the beginning. The house had settled into its nighttime hush, that soft, heavy silence that comes after dinner, after dishes, after all the ordinary things are put away. I stood in the hallway, half in shadow, half in the thin strip of yellow light leaking from the living room lamp. That's when I heard her. Mara's voice floated down the hall like a whisper pressed through cupped hands, hushed, careful, almost tender. Her tone held something fragile. Something I couldn't name. And as I listened, breath still and shoulders tense, I realized it wasn't the words that stirred something uneasy in me. It was the reverence. Like she wasn't talking to someone, but about something. Something that had to do with me. I leaned against the wall, pretending to look at the framed picture of the lake from last summer, but my attention stayed fixed on the sound of Mara's voice. It rose and fell softly, like she was stepping around a sleeping child. Like every syllable mattered. I couldn't make out the words, just the cadence, the way she kept pausing. As if waiting for someone on the other end to guide her. When she finally stepped out of the kitchen, phone pressed to her chest, she froze. Not a startled freeze, a calculating one. Her eyes met mine for a single heartbeat. Then she smiled. A soft, quick smile that didn't quite match the lingering heaviness in her voice. Just checking in with a friend, she said. Her thumb hovered over the end call button. Then she tapped it with quiet finality, as though closing a door I wasn't meant to see behind. Daniel came in, humming something from the radio, joy spilling out of him the way it always did when he felt at ease. He looped an arm around my shoulders and asked if we wanted to watch an old movie, something from his college days. Mara said yes. I said yes. But as we walked toward the living room, the air felt different, stretched thin, pulled tight. A string I hadn't noticed before was suddenly trembling. The living room lights flickered once, then steadied. Daniel set up the movie, humming to himself, completely unaware of the quiet storm gathering around us. The screen glowed pale blue against the walls, washing the furniture in soft shadows. Mara sat on the far end of the couch, legs tucked under her, arms wrapped gently around a throw pillow. Daniel sat in the middle. And I settled on the opposite side, close enough to feel his warmth, far enough to keep Mara's gaze from resting directly on me, but it did anyway. Every few minutes, I felt her eyes slide over me, curious and slow, like she was trying to compare me to an image she had been carrying in her mind long before tonight. On the screen, two characters laughed, their voices bright and uncomplicated. Daniel laughed too, always a second late, always a little louder. But the sound slipped right past me, because Mara wasn't watching the movie. Not really. I caught her reflection in the darkened window, her head tilted slightly, her eyes fixed on me with an expression I had seen only once before. Recognition. Like she was seeing something familiar in my face. Something she had been searching for, and the longer her gaze lingered, the more I felt it, that small, crawling sense of being studied, measured, remembered. Halfway through the movie, Daniel fell asleep, his head sliding slowly toward the back of the couch, breath deep and steady. The room dimmed as the scene on the screen shifted to night. Shadows pulled across the carpet, rising up the walls, soft and moving like water. Mara didn't look away. Not when the music changed. Not when the characters began crying. Not even when Daniel snored softly beside us. She was studying me. Quietly. Deliberately. Is everything okay? I finally whispered, my voice barely louder than the movie soundtrack. Mara blinked. Her lips parted, then closed again. A small, almost imperceptible breath left her chest. You just... She said softly, you remind me of someone. The line came out gentle, but the weight behind it pressed into the room like a hand on my back. Someone. The word hung between us, stretched thin and trembling. Who? I asked. She looked down, as though the answer lived somewhere near her shoes. Or nowhere at all. When she lifted her head again, her smile was too small, too careful. I'm still figuring that out. And somehow that unsettled me more than any name she could have given, because it wasn't confusion in her voice. It was certainty waiting for confirmation. Recognition waiting for permission. The movie ended. Daniel snored quietly, unaware of the silence that had replaced the soundtrack. I stood first. Mara stood a moment later, her shadow falling across mine as we passed in the narrow hallway. She didn't touch me. But her shoulder brushed the air beside me, close enough to feel intentional. When I reached my bedroom door, I felt her eyes on my back again, not suspicious, not cold, but searching. As if something inside her was calling out to something inside me. Waiting for an answer neither of us was ready to give. I closed my door, leaning against it, listening to the faint click of her footsteps fading down the hall, and in the dark, I whispered the question that had been rising all evening. What exactly does she see when she looks at me? The house was quiet, but the silence felt thick, almost like it had weight. I sat on the edge of the couch, knees tucked under, hands fidgeting with the hem of my sweater. Outside, the winter wind rattled the loose window pane, sending a faint shiver through the room. Mara's smile lingered across from me, too perfect, too measured, as if it had been rehearsed. Her eyes flicked briefly to mine, then away, and I realized my pulse had tightened against my ribs. The name hung in the air between us, Lena, a word I had whispered only twice in my life, buried beneath years and memories. And yet, here she was, speaking it as though she had the right to know it. I tried to keep my breathing steady, pretending the book in my lap demanded attention. But I couldn't tear my gaze from her face. Every small gesture she made felt intentional, the way her fingers brushed the edge of the coffee table, the way she tilted her head just slightly when Daniel chuckled at something on the movie screen. I reminded myself that Daniel hadn't noticed anything unusual yet. He laughed, leaned back, drank in the normalcy of the evening. Blissfully unaware of the undercurrent twisting through the room, the firelight flickered against the walls. Soft shadows dancing across the hardwood floor. I could feel the years pressing against my chest, the ones where Lena was not yet a secret, not yet a story, not yet a ghost. Mara's presence reminded me of that old fear, the idea that something buried can still find its way back. That past lives quietly in the objects around us, in the half-forgotten names, in the words you think only you remember. Her eyes met mine again, steady this time, searching. And for the first time all evening, I wondered if she already knew more than I wanted her to. The thought made the room smaller, tighter, as if the walls had leaned in to listen too. I spoke before thinking, letting the words slip past my teeth with a quiet tremor. What made you say it? The name? Lena? Her smile faltered. Just for a moment, a tiny, almost imperceptible slip. Then her head tilted, and her hands rested loosely in her lap, still as if she feared moving might shatter the moment. I've heard it before, she said finally, her voice soft, almost unsure. She paused, a silence stretching between us that seemed to hum with electricity. Years ago, someone told me about Lena. Someone who? Said they owed a debt. Her eyes met mine fully this time. They held something I wasn't expecting, expectation. Not demand, not accusation, but a quiet pleading, like she needed me to fill in a story she could not finish alone. The words struck me in the chest. Only 2 people had ever known that name. One of them was long dead. The other? Had never spoken of it to anyone. I felt my knees give a little, though I stayed seated. My fingers dug into the couch cushion, gripping the fabric as if it could anchor me to the present. Past and present collided in a way that left the room spinning. Mara waited patiently, almost reverently, her silence pressing me to respond. I started, and my voice caught. The name, the story, the memory, it all threatened to spill. Years of silence hovered in the air, heavy and almost tangible. She leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on her knees, eyes searching mine. Please, she whispered. Tell me. I need to understand. The floor beneath me seemed to tilt, as though the past itself had shifted. I remembered the second person who knew the name. The one who had taken their secrets to the grave. The one who had bound my youth in shadow and promise, whose absence left a hollow echo in every room I entered. I wanted to close my mouth, to let the silence stretch on forever. But Mara's gaze held me there, steady, patient, insistently curious. It was more than curiosity. It was recognition, the sense that she understood pieces of my story that even I had tried to forget. Someone, she said again. Softly, said they owed it to Lena. The words hovered like smoke in the dim light. I could see the way she hoped I would remember, that I would connect the dots she could not. And I did, slowly. One name, one story, buried in years of careful forgetting. And suddenly, I realized I had left a trail behind, a whisper, a memory, a clue I never thought would matter again. I leaned back, exhaling slowly, feeling the pulse of the room in my chest. Mara's eyes never left mine, still searching, still waiting for confirmation. Outside, the wind rattled the windows again. Low and steady, as if it too carried stories of the past. I didn't know whether the past was reaching for me, or if I had simply left it in the open, waiting for someone to notice. Either way, the balance had shifted. The quiet of the evening had changed, and the simple act of naming Lena had opened a door I thought was long sealed. I felt both fear and a strange relief. The two pressing together like winter ice and sunlight. Mara's presence lingered in the corner of my vision, her expression unreadable, yet undeniably tied to something I had once lost. And as the night deepened, I whispered to myself, barely audible, what else will she see if I start to tell the truth? The lamp in the corner flickered once, sending a thin sliver of light across the rug. Outside, wind rattled the window pane like a faint warning, brushing leaves across the frost-stiffened lawn. I sat frozen at the edge of the couch, hands clasped tightly in my lap, while Mara leaned forward, her eyes steady, soft, yet impossible to read. She spoke quietly, deliberately, each word weighted as though she carried the gravity of decades. I found you, she said. Not loudly. Not triumphantly. But with a calm inevitability that made the room feel smaller, tighter, pressed against my chest. The name Lena rose in my mind before she even spoke it. And I realized, in a slow, sinking way, that my past had caught up to me. The house felt impossibly still, as if holding its breath alongside me. Daniel leaned back, fidgeting with the corner of his blanket, oblivious to the quiet storm swirling in the space between us. Mara's gaze never wavered. She looked at me the way someone studies an old photograph, familiar, careful, wanting to see what time had changed and what had stayed the same. I remembered the boy I had once known. 17. Summer heat burning the back of my neck. Secrets buried under laughter and scraped knees. A promise made in the shade of a cedar tree. I had run. I had taken a name, a memory, a fragment of his life with me, and left the rest behind. Now, decades later, she was speaking of him, her father, and of a girl who had saved his life. I felt my fingers tremble, the warmth draining from my palms. My heart was too large and too small all at once, crammed with years of silence, waiting to spill. Every inch of me wanted to run again, hide in the kitchen, in the winter dark hallways, anywhere but here. But Mara's voice held a steady gravity, anchoring me to the couch, to the room, to the impossible question hovering between us. I searched for you, she said, voice low, almost reverent. Because I felt it was time to close a circle. One that's been left open too long. The words landed like snow on glass, fragile, crystalline, yet sharp. I tried to blink past the weight of them, past the ache in my chest that came from knowing she spoke of the boy I had loved, the one I had run from as she paused. Letting the silence thicken, letting Daniel's unseeing presence melt into the background. Her fingers brushed the edge of the coffee table, tracing a line as if mapping the invisible path she had followed to find me. My father, she continued, once told me about a girl. A girl named Lena. She saved his life, then vanished. The room tilted. My throat tightened. I felt the cold settle along my spine. The boy I ran from. The boy whose secret I had carried through the years. He was the father she spoke of. I opened my mouth, but no sound came. Daniel cleared his throat, turning to look at me, confusion etched into his features. Everything okay? He asked, voice breaking the spell. I nodded, though the nod was thin. The air between Mara and me vibrated, taut with unspoken understanding. Mara's hand moved slowly toward mine. Not demanding, not intrusive, gentle, deliberate. Her eyes held something I had not expected, a trust, fragile as spun glass, waiting for me to decide. If I spoke the truth, everything would change. Not just for me, not just for her, but for the years that had carried secrets and half-truths like a fragile cargo across my life. If I stayed silent, she would fill the gaps herself, weaving a story out of what little she knew. And the tale she constructed might not be mine at all. The winter light caught the curve of her hand as it hovered near mine, a single degree from touch. I thought of 17-year-old me, running down dusty roads, heart clenched, carrying a name that belonged to someone else's memory. I thought of the promises I had made in shadowed corners and half-lit hallways, promises I had buried deep enough to forget. And yet, here they were, unearthed by a stranger who somehow knew just enough to ask the right questions. I swallowed, feeling the cold press of decision in my chest. She was waiting. Patient, unjudging, hopeful. The quiet in the room was thick, alive, as if holding its breath for the moment I would speak, or remain silent, and let the past continue whispering between us. I took a slow breath and let it out. Her hand lingered close, the warmth teasing the edge of mine, a quiet offering, a question. Daniel shifted in his sleep, curling slightly, unaware of the gravity pressing down around us. Outside, the wind rose again, scattering dry leaves across the driveway. The house, too, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the story to be told. I realized then that silence was no longer neutral. It was a choice. And whatever I chose would shape the way she saw me, and the girl I had been, for the rest of her life. I let my gaze linger on Mara's expectant eyes, knowing that in the next moment, I would either reach for the truth, or let the story write itself. Which circle am I brave enough to close? The morning light came soft, brushing through the curtains like a whispered apology. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, golden and slow, as if the house itself had paused to listen. I sat at the kitchen table, hands folded over a steaming mug of tea, feeling the tremor of years in my chest. Mara sat across from me, quiet, her posture open, her eyes steady but gentle, like someone who had traveled far to understand. Daniel leaned in from the corner, his blanket half falling off his lap, trying not to fidget, trying to be patient with the weight of what I was about to say. The room held its breath. And I knew, with a strange mix of fear and relief, that the story I had carried alone for decades was finally ready to be told. I took a shaky breath and let it fill my lungs. Then let it out slowly, like untying a knot I hadn't felt in years. The kettle whistled in the background, small and ordinary, grounding me to the present, yet every second carried the echo of the past. The name Lena had been a ghost for so long, a fragment of a girl I once was, a secret I buried to survive. I took a shaky breath and let it fill my lungs, then let it out slowly, like untying a knot I hadn't felt in years. The kettle whistled in the background, small and ordinary, grounding me to the present, yet every second carried the echo of the past. The name Lena had been a ghost for so long, a fragment of a girl I once was, a secret I buried to survive. I glanced at Mara, and something about her stillness unsettled me. She wasn't here to judge. She wasn't here to probe for scandal or weakness. She was here to witness. To listen. To hold a space for what I had kept buried. Daniel shifted in his chair, eyes wide, but soft, watching the tension and the quiet tremor in my hands. I noticed how he looked at me now, not the mother who had always protected, but the woman who had carried secrets, who had lived through choices made in shadow. The light in the room shifted, spilling across the table and illuminating the lines in my face, the scars of silence. I felt an odd mix of exposure and relief, like standing in winter sun after a long, dark night. Everything seemed poised on the edge of confession, waiting for the words to fall. I started quietly, almost as if talking to myself. The name Lena? It belonged to someone I was once. Someone I had to leave behind, I said, tracing the rim of my mug with a finger. The girl I was at 17? She didn't survive what happened. Ellen did. And in order for her to live, Lena had to die. Mara leaned forward slightly, but did not speak. Her eyes were steady, absorbing every syllable, every pause, as if cataloging the rhythm of my truth. Daniel's jaw tightened imperceptibly, a slow awareness settling over him, and I saw the shift, not disappointment, not shock, but understanding. He let the story reach him without interruption, without judgment. I described the boy, the summer, the choices made in haste and desperation. I told them about the letter I burned, the photograph I hid, the diary pages I never dared to read aloud. Each memory was a brushstroke, painting the picture of who I had been and what I had lost. Mara's hand stayed on the table, fingertips barely touching the wood, a quiet offering of empathy. And in that soft, silent space, I realized I was no longer afraid to speak. When the last words hung in the air, a hush fell over the room. Mara's eyes softened, and she gave the faintest nod, the kind of nod that carries both recognition and reverence. I think I understand, she said softly. And I'm glad you told me. I didn't come to uncover. I came to return what was lost. I felt a weight lift from my chest, the burden of decades slowly uncoiling like smoke from a fire that had burned too long in silence. Daniel exhaled, the tension leaving his shoulders. And for the first time in a long while, the house felt quiet without holding its breath. The sunlight grew warmer, touching the edges of the furniture, the table, the chairs, bathing the room in a sense of closure I had not thought possible. I looked at Mara and understood something that had escaped me before. She had not come to disrupt, but to complete. To witness the story that had been mine alone, and to honor it. And then, a thought flickered through my mind, gentle but persistent. If she had brought this closure, what else had she carried into my life that I had yet to see? The question lingered, light as a shadow, as I allowed myself to simply breathe. I set the mug down, feeling the warmth seep into the table and the room. The house seemed lighter, as if the walls themselves had exhaled, letting go of the years of silent tension. The name Lena, once a ghost that haunted every corner of my memory, now felt like a bird released from a cage, wings trembling in the morning light. Mara's eyes met mine. Calm, patient, expectant, a quiet invitation to whatever came next. Daniel smiled faintly, the understanding in his eyes steady, reassuring. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine that the past might finally rest. But the thought lingered, soft and persistent. If Lena has returned to let me go, what else has Mara brought into my life that I have yet to see? And in that still, golden morning, I felt the fragile stirrings of a story still waiting to unfold.